All right, let's bring this on. Jordan Peterson meets Ayn Rand, Objectivism. This is my home territory. Now, I've only been studying Jordan Peterson for 2.5 years, whatever. I probably have 1,000, 1,500 hours under my belt studying his work. I have reasonable understanding of what he's about. Ayn Rand, more in the 6,000, 8,000, 9,000 hour range, something. But I think I can do a good job here. So let's get into it. First, it's just a comment on the nature of the dialogue. I don't know if it's his dark web, Brett Weinstein, Steel Manning, whatever it is, if it's his carnivore diet, but Jordan Peterson was in kind form. He didn't get upset. He didn't get bitter. He was just, in the conversation. When the Objectivist made a good point, he was listening. Okay, so I think this. Okay, that's good. I'll go with that. But now the question is, so Jordan Peterson at his best in terms of heavy-duty conversation. We're talking about metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, a little bit in politics, aesthetics. Like, we're going after the big five. We're going for it here. And he did well. Greg Salmieri, fantastic job. Yaron stood out a little bit more stridently. I don't think Yaron is actually used to having a truly good interlocutor, someone who really can go toe to toe with him. I mean, Yaron did a fine job, but you can't compare him with Greg Salmieri. Now, of course, he's the finance guy and Salmieri's the philosopher. Yes. But I would love to see Yaron playing more of a philosophical game around this. This is an opportunity here. Let's go, brother. Okay, so getting into it. Because I speak Jordan Peterson and because I speak Ayn Rand as languages, let me do some translating and let me show where these ideas actually come together. I think they covered more ground than is obvious at first listen, and I think they set the stage for future conversations that could get really interesting. So I'm going to tie some threads together and make meaning where things might have slipped by. Simplify, get down to the essence, put it on the table, set the stage for future conversations.
And we talk a lot about rights in our society, way too much as far as I'm concerned. Not that they're not important, but they're secondary because the fundamental issue of import with regards to individual sovereignty isn't rights, it's responsibility. I mean, first of all, you could make a case that your rights are my responsibility and vice versa. So there's a parallelism between rights and responsibility. But even more importantly, if the integrity of the state is dependent on the integrity of the individual, and that's the argument that's implicit in the idea that the individual is sovereign, then it's obviously the case that the individual has a great responsibility. And it's a responsibility that's of incredible importance because it's not just limited to you. It's you acting responsibly actually constitutes the bedrock of the state. And so that's an interesting issue. It means that you're required in some sense to take responsibility or the entire state will shake, and I think that's true for everyone. But more interestingly, I think this is a more interesting argument in some sense, is that you need a meaning to sustain you through life, or you need meaning. Perhaps not a meaning. You need meaning to sustain you through life because life is bitterly difficult and ultimately challenging, mortally challenging for that matter. And you need a meaning to sustain you through that so that it doesn't embitter you and turn you into a victim, let's say. And it's pretty obvious to me, and I think obvious to anyone when they think it through, that virtually everything that you derive genuine meaning from, and I mean the kind of meaning that will sustain you when times are difficult. I don't mean casual happiness, even though there's nothing wrong with happiness. The meaning that will sustain you through the tragedy of life is always to be found in the adoption of responsibility. And the people that you admire spontaneously, and I don't think there's an exception to this unless you're a little on the psychopathic side, and I mean that technically, you feel, I do, I mean it technically, it's a hallmark of psychopathy, I would say, generally speaking, you admire yourself to the degree that you do when you're at least taking care of yourself, at least that, and maybe when you have a little responsibility left over for your family and maybe some to spill over for the broader community. And certainly the people that you spontaneously admire in your fellow men are people who, at minimum, are accounting for the burden of themselves, at minimum that, but then who have excess capacity and devote that to the proper care of their family and their community. And so I don't think that we've done a good job of laying out the meaning equals responsibility equation, and it's vitally important. And I think it's very helpful for people to learn that. Lots of people have told me that you know, that they've been getting their lives together and digging them out of themselves out of a nihilistic and hopeless hole, and doing that by understanding that the meaning they need to sustain them is to be found through the adoption of the maximal responsibility they can sustain.
So Jordan starts off with one of his more familiar talking points when he's talking about politics and how the individual relates with society. And he says that rights and responsibilities are like two sides of the same coin. That if you have a right, then I have a responsibility. And it's a very interesting idea. I think it's fundamentally true. But he misses an important point that Greg Salmieri points out immediately. As soon as he gets into it, he points it out. And that is that when we're talking about responsibilities, we're actually talking about responsibilities on two different levels of analysis. There's the responsibility we have to ourselves and how we create a good life. How do we approach our lives in such a way that we actually create a good life? And that's what we might call ethics. That's the level of morality, what I would call responsibility. And then there's the level of politics, right? The level of how we relate to other people and our responsibilities in relation to other people. If I'm alone on a desert island, I still have to be responsible for my own life, responsible for my own happiness, responsible for my own meaning. But when I'm in relationship to other people, then I have responsibilities to them as being part of the relationship, part of the partnership of what it means to interact and have a relationship with someone. In terms of trade, I have a responsibility in terms of how I trade with people in order to establish a certain kind of relationship. And that's a political level, what I would call the level of respect versus responsibility, right? It's politics versus ethics. And that these are two fundamentally different contexts. And although we use the word responsibility for both of those contexts, it's important to recognize that they're different contexts. It's a different thing to be responsible for my own life versus what am I responsible for vis-a-vis another human being? How am I in society? How am I in relationship? That there's a different kind of responsibility than the responsibility I have to myself. Now, it is fair to say that they're of the same species, this responsibility, whether I'm being responsible to my own life or whether I'm being responsible to how I need to treat other people in order to have a civil society. Those are both types of responsibility, but they are not equivalent. Here's how Greg Salmieri puts it.
I gave a talk at actually the event that I met you at called Taking Responsibility for Your Happiness. I think I have a bit of a different view of happiness than you do, and Rand has a different one than you do, where what I mean by happiness isn't the transient joy or emotion you could feel in a moment, but the state of being, the state of emotion that comes from achieving your values, having taken responsibility, set yourself goals, and leading a life where you're achieving those goals over time. And I think that's what ethics is about. I think that's what gives meaning to life, and a really deep part of that is taking responsibility for yourself. I a little bit bristle at the idea of saying that responsibility is more important than rights, or the reverse. I think they're issues that come up at a different tier. So I think taking responsibility for yourself is a matter of ethics. It's a matter of how you live your own life. It's a matter of how you lead a life worth living and be happy and have meaning. I think those go together. But then rights are the conditions that we need when we organize as a society to make everybody able to do that, not to be impinging on each other. And if we don't all value our own lives and happiness, if we're not all taking responsibility, or at least if many of us aren't, we're not going to have a society that cares about rights, and they're going to go away. And So in that sense, I agree we need to have this shift to talking about ethics and what we want to make of our lives, each of us.
So when Jordan Peterson says, oh, that's fine, that is a very important point of agreement between objectivism and Jordan Peterson. This is key. It is foundational. It is critical in terms of understanding both Jordan Peterson and objectivism and how these two communities, these two things can work together. So I want to dig into this for just a moment, because if there's a responsibility to yourself to live a good life, I mean, you actually have to figure out what's going to build prosperity in your life and what's going to give you meaning and purpose and what's going to give you pleasure and happiness. You're the one who needs to figure that out. And you're the one who needs to implement, clean your room, take care of your stuff, check your premises, become a productive human being, and actually make your life work. You are the one who is responsible for that. And that is the fundamental responsibility. That is the ethical responsibility that we have as human beings to ourselves. And then there's the question of how do we treat other people? And it's very interesting. Until and unless you can take care of yourself, until and unless you have the integrity of ethics, the integrity of responsibility, then when it actually comes to interacting with other people, if you don't have integrity with yourself, how can you have integrity with them? It is unlikely. The more you have integrity with yourself, the more you can interact with other people in ways that are complex, in which they can count on your integrity. And Jordan Peterson gets this when he says that if human beings are going to be responsible for themselves, that is essential to having a civil society. If we want to have the kind of constitutional protections for individual rights, where our society is a collection of individuals, each of which has individual rights and is free to interact with others according to their conscience. If we want to create this, then the individuals need to have integrity. They need to take responsibility for themselves. Or rather, as I like to say, the more they take responsibility for themselves, the better the society can be. The more civil it can be, the more it can flourish. But this individual responsibility, cleaning your room, checking your premises, actually doing the work, taking responsibility for your life, not saying somehow or someone, but I will do it. I will make it happen. The more you do that, the more it makes society possible. And it's certainly the case that if people do not take responsibility for themselves, then society begins to collapse. That happens. But that's different than saying that because you have a right, I have a responsibility towards you. The central responsibility I have towards you is not to violate your rights. That's the basis. Now, on top of that, if I'm actually a person of integrity, I can build plans with you. We can make agreements and commitments and contracts. And if I can fulfill my side of the bargain, if I've cleaned my room and I've built an actual self, if I've got integrity to bring to it, then you and I can create more together. We can trade what we have created. All of my integrity and all of the work that I've done in myself, I can now bring to you and trade it to you for all of the work and all of the integrity you've done for yourself. And then we can both be richer through trade, whether I'm giving you the money I've earned for a product or service that you've created, or I'm giving you my product and service for your money, or we're doing some kind of trade, or we're getting into business together in some format, or we're partnering in order to be on a team in sports, or we're part of a community that's putting on a party. Whatever it is, the more I can bring real value, real integrity to the party, and the more you can, and the more we recognize that the only reason we need to interact is because we want to, because I'm going to trade something for you and you're going to trade something for me. And if that's not the case, we essentially don't need to interact. That is this idea that Ayn Rand would call individual rights and capitalism. And while Jordan hasn't agreed to that at this point, I think that he has set up the foundation for that kind of agreement, that in differentiating between ethics and politics, between what it means to take responsibility for your own life and what it means to be responsible in your relationship with others, to recognize that difference sets the stage for Ayn Rand's fundamental argument for what we might call rational selfishness, which includes the selfishness of building good relationships with others, in respecting their rights in the same way that you want your rights to be respected. The responsibility that we take to create our own lives, to achieve our own values, to create our own meaning, to build a character that is worth waking up to, something that, as Jordan Peterson would say, is someone who can be of service when your father dies at the funeral. Like, to take that kind of responsibility is the source of ethics and meaning. So when we make this distinction between the responsibility we have to ourself, our own life, our own values, our own meaning, to create a self worth waking up to, and the responsibilities we have for others on the level of politics versus ethics, on the level of respect versus responsibility, like, what kind of respect do we need to offer other people? What's required? In terms of this rational selfishness in which we take responsibility for our own lives and our own meaning, we clean our own room, when we look at ourselves selfishly and rationally, then we want to build great relationships with other people. We want our relationships to be productive and enjoyable and meaningful and deep and profound. Of course, any rationally selfish person wants those kinds of relationships. But notice, as Peterson comes back to again and again, this Piagetian equilibrated game means that you have to think about your relationships in terms of not just winning a particular battle, but you want to win the war, right? You want to build a relationship with someone such that they'll play with you again and again and again. Why? Because you are rationally selfish. Because if you don't create games with people where you can play with them over and over and over again, then you lose the value of all of the games that you could play. All of the relationship that you can build over time gets lost unless you treat them in a manner of respect, unless you take responsibility for yourself, clean your room inside and out, and then meet other people with respect, such that they want to play games with you over and over and over again. And not just this one person, but a wide variety of people. You want to build yourself in a way that you can connect with lots of people over time. That is the rationally selfish thing to do. In terms of your ethics, if you want to create a great life for yourself, then you need to have a politics of respect, where you actually honor other people's rights, where you play a game where they want to play with you through time. And this is the fundamental expression of individual rights in a political context. It's that you recognize that other people don't have to play with you. People don't have to interact with you. They're acting with you voluntarily. You have friendships. You trade with them. You partner with them. You join communities with them. The more you bring integrity to that process and the more you treat them with respect, the more you use your responsibility to honor their rights. Right? And this is where the responsibility and rights come together. The more you do that, the more you play a Piagetian equilibrated game that lasts through time. That's the rationally selfish thing to do. And when you think about it this way, when you translate between this objectivist Ayn Rand language and Jordan Peterson's language, you actually find these incredible areas of overlap. I actually think this is one of the primary reasons that people on the left really dislike Jordan Peterson so much. They know that he is actually promoting the individual over the collective. He's truly doing individual rights, which is a fundamentally libertarian Ayn Rand perspective. Jordan's arguments as an objectivist, although I can disagree with his epistemology or I can find fault with it, I can find it problematic in a variety of ways, although I don't really that much. I think he just uses a different methodology, but I think it completely complements Ayn Rand's. I don't think they're actually at odds, right? They have different metaphysical premises, but not fundamentally. And this rationally selfish approach to how we do relationships, if we really take it seriously, is a game changer. And I highly recommend that we all take it seriously. When we clean our room, when we decide what our truth is, what is true, and we listen to that voice and we only say the things that are true, when we stand up for ourselves, when we decide what we want to do, and then we go out in the world and make it happen. We build our capacities by cleaning our room, by learning to work with other people in our family, in our immediate environment, in our jobs. When we take on responsibility, when we clean up our unfinished business and we become more and more powerful, when we bring more integrity to our relationships, it allows us to create interdependence in this rationally self-interested way, such that we can truly build a civil society. The congruence between Jordan Peterson and Objectivism about this is a critical point, and I look forward to that being extrapolated further as we move forward.
I mean, it is collectivism versus individualism, I think, the fundamental polarizing force that's at work at the moment. And the issue with the collectivist types is whether or not they're collectivist because they care about the dispossessed, which is their fundamental claim, or whether they're collectivist because they don't want to bear any of the responsibility that would go along with being a responsible individual. And you know, I'm always skeptical of the saint-like moral claims that are put forth by people who are pushing a given ideology. And I'm skeptical about that on my part too. I mean, the people who criticize my perspective say, look, Dr. Peterson, you're not, or maybe they call me something a lot less flattering than that. You know, they say you're underestimating the degree to which systemic barriers make it impossible for people to move forward properly in the world. There's barriers to the progress that people can make even if they bear individual responsibility, and those barriers are distributed unequally. And of course there's some truth in that, because every system tends towards rigidity and tyranny, and no system does a perfect job of selecting among its people for pure competence. But there's a difference between saying that a system is somewhat corrupt, which is certainly the case with Western systems, and the system is an absolutely corrupt, tyrannical patriarchy with no hope of redemption whatsoever and needs to be burned to the ground and reformulated. Those are really different. And, you know, it's also possible to be sensible and say, well, look, I mean, obviously, the manner in which people are selected for success in our society is imperfect. But also to note, well, imperfect compared to what exactly? Like to your hypothetical utopian perfection, which you would self-generate if you were given ultimate power, because that's really the comparison, or to our societies in the past, because we're doing a lot better now than we were, or compared to every other society that's ever existed since the dawn of time, by which standard we're doing so insanely well that it's actually almost unbelievable. And this is another thing that I've been trying to promote. I mean, there's been at least a dozen books written in the last 6 or 7 years by fairly serious scholars, and I would say distributed across the political spectrum, pointing out that ever since the year 2000, things are getting better so fast that it's actually a miracle. The question is, what the hell are the collectivists up to? You know, why are they? Well,
that's what I was going to say.
Like, what's the problem here? And the problem seems to be a certain amount of ignorance, a certain amount of willful blindness, and a certain amount of discomfort with the fact that a fair bit of that wealth has been purchased at the price of a continuing inequality. We don't know how to generate wealth without also generating inequality. And I actually don't think that you can generate wealth without generating inequality.
And here is where Yaron shines in this conversation, as he brings in his work on inequality. He has a bold idea and a bold statement, which is that inequality, when it's done in the free market, when it's done according to a healthy hierarchy, a non-corrupt hierarchy, is not ethically bad. It's not distasteful. It is a natural and even good thing. Of course, this is an incredibly bold position to take, and it's one that Peterson actually consistently argues against for a certain reason. He says that what happens is, in a hierarchy, because of Price's law, Pareto distributions, you get a few people on the top who get a lot, and then there's lots of people who stack up at the bottom. And he says that when people stack up at the bottom, they feel like they have nothing to lose, and then they tear down the whole hierarchy. And he says the research is in on this, but Steven Pinker, in his book Enlightenment Now, actually questions that research. and says, no, that's actually not it. And the conversation between Pinker and Peterson on this was really interesting. I wish they had gotten into it in more depth. But that is an empirical question about whether or not people stack up at the bottom and then they tear down the hierarchy. Is that something that is a real danger? Is there more crime at the bottom of a hierarchy? Or is it the fact that there are so many hierarchies that everyone can get up higher in some of the hierarchies? Or is it the case that there are enough different hierarchies that anyone who puts their attention on it can actually begin to rise up in one of the hierarchies or multiple of the hierarchies such that they don't have to be at the bottom? Now, Jordan Peterson talks about the 10% that are under 83 IQ, and that is an issue. Then the question becomes, how do we deal with that? Do we deal with that through a government program, or do we deal with that through charity? That's another question to be answered. And for those of you who haven't read Yaron Brook's and Don Watkins' book on inequality, it will systematically blow your mind because they make the argument extraordinarily clearly. You might not agree with their argument, but even if you don't agree with it, as you actually go through the argument and confront all of the ideas they have to say, I assure you that it will change your perspective on inequality. So in this area of inequality and the problematic nature of inequality or the fine nature of inequality, like, is it really a problem? I think that we have some unfinished business between Jordan Peterson and Objectivism. And I think that Objectivism has a special foothold in this particular conversation because Jordan Peterson is already, as a psychologist who's studied the Holocaust, who's studied concentration camps and studied socialism, he understands the psychology of envy. And when you take the idea of envy and put it into a hierarchy, the question is not so much, do you stack up at the bottom, but how do you understand stacking up at the bottom? Do you understand that through a psychology of envy or not? And while it is certainly not enough to just morally say, well, you shouldn't be envious, like wagging your finger, as a psychologist, we want to teach people not to be envious. And this is a whole section of Jordan Peterson's work. So he already understands the importance of envy and the danger of envy. And the question becomes, when you take the envy factor out of the analysis, how much of that hierarchical pyramid, the Pareto distribution, how much of that is truly problematic once you take envy out of the equation? And if envy is the fundamental determining factor, if it accounts for most of the variance, as we might say, that fundamentally shifts the nature of the conversation back into the objectivist camp. And if Steven Pinker's analysis of the empirical data is more accurate than Jordan's, that also pushes the camp into the objectivist perspective. Yaron puts it like this.
Inequality is a feature of freedom, not a bug. Mm-hmm. It just comes with freedom. You're absolutely right. You cannot create wealth without inequality. And there's nothing wrong with inequality. There's nothing bad about inequality. There's nothing morally offensive about inequality. And in particular, given that what happens is that everybody's getting richer. Mm-hmm. Everybody gets richer. They just get richer at a different pace. And the reason they get richer at a different pace is because they're producing different quantities of value. The people who actually get very rich in a free market, now we don't have a pure free market and all kinds of problems with the system we have, but in a free market, you only gain those values that you produce. Jeff Bezos is the richest person in the world because how many of you shop on Amazon? Everybody, right? So there's a reason he's produced values that have affected almost every human being on the planet, and that is why he is so wealthy.
Salmieri puts it like this.
One point that Rand made about this, and I think making this point is part of the solution to people being envious, letting people internalize this point, is that other people's goodness, other people's accomplishments, other people's intelligence, other people's wealth if they've earned it, and a society that enables the most productive, smartest people to achieve what they can achieve is good for everyone, and especially good for the people at the bottom of whatever hierarchy we might be talking about, of whatever level of ability, whatever level of money. And we can see that in giving a little bit more freedom, a little bit more capitalism in countries like China and India has helped, well, everyone there, but disproportionately the poorest people who were starving to death, who had incredible infant mortality rates, and you were talking about this before, and we've seen them go down.
And Yaron says,
so the whole inequality debate is to try to drive people towards envy. The whole inequality debate is to try to undercut the idea of freedom, because what they're really after is not reducing inequality. What they're really after is eliminating freedom. It's the same people who used to advocate for an ideology of communism or socialism. Now that's being discredited, so they have to call it something else. Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize winner in economics, is not going to come out for communism. But in a sense, he views that as the moral ideal. You can't get there. It's rough. There's a little too violence, too much blood for his taste. He's an economist after all, right? So inequality is a nice disguise. Oh, we want to reduce inequality. In my debates with people who talk about inequality, I say, but how much? Well, we'll know when we get there. Who will know? Who gets to decide? How are we going to vote? How much are we going to take? And why? Why just monetary inequality? I mean, Dave's a good-looking guy. It's not fair. Can I have some of that, Dave?
It's a lot of it's a lot of hairspray, man. Trust me.
I mean, how do we do that? How do we, you know, there've been experiments in trying to equal us. In the book, we give the example, of course, of the tragedy of the horrific tragedy of Cambodia and the Khmer Rouge, where the attempt is to equalize, not just on monetary issues, but on smarts. Well, the only way to do that is to kill the educated and the smart. On every other factor, on who's a good farmer and who's a good forager for food, they killed them all. 40% of the population. It's
As Salmieri says,
I think envy, part of the cause of envy is wrong moral views that people have. Moral views that hold that the purpose of someone's life isn't to achieve things in their own life, isn't to reach their own happiness, isn't to form a company like Microsoft and get a computer on every desk in the world running Microsoft software. If someone does that, we think he's selfish, we think it's bad, or at least it's neutral, and we envy him and resent him if we're brought up to think that way. Whereas if we're brought up to appreciate the people who created this tremendous prosperity that both of you were talking about, and to see that as morally good and as right and as benefiting all of us, but benefiting us not because they did it for us, but because taking responsibility for your life, having goals, having something you want out of life, leading a life of your own on a grand scale, for your own sake, is what benefits not only you, but makes you a value to everybody else. If we had a society that understood that, I think that combats the envy. And one of the things that Rand wrote, she had a really interesting article called The Age of Envy that talked about, and also another article called The Untitled Letter, which was a comment on Rawls. And she was very concerned about this kind of egalitarianism and this kind of growing nihilism and envy in the culture. She thought of it as un-American. This isn't the kind of thing, this was more characteristic of Europe in the 40s, and this wasn't an American way of thinking, but it was catching on here. And I think she was prophetic in that. I think we're seeing a lot of that today.
So I'm going to end here with these three basic points. One, that there's a difference between the responsibility of ethics and the responsibility of politics, and we shouldn't confuse those, although they are related. Second, that responsibility in ethics is about being rationally self-interested. It's about cleaning your room, telling your truth, having integrity with yourself. While politics is about the Piagetian equilibrated game, which is still a rationally self-interested perspective. And this, I'll call it an inquiry into inequality, which is asking the question, is inequality itself the problem, or is it an envious perspective on that inequality? These three potential congruences between Jordan Peterson and Objectivism that came out in this debate are truly exciting for me, and I'm looking forward to these future conversations. So let's have more. Again, I'm Mark Michael Lewis, the Profitability Coach from the Human Thriving Institute, suggesting to you that you make your deepest happiness your highest priority.